So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. A big welcome to our wonderful panel. My name's Sarah Chater. I'm the Principal Investigator for IPPO, the International Public Policy Observatory. And we exist really to identify and synthesize evidence to inform public policy making. We work across four main thematic areas, which are net zero, socioeconomic inequalities, the impact of COVID, and place and spatial inequalities. And alongside all of that, as we've been delivering the project through IPPO, we've been considering how evidence can best be used in policymaking on some of the complexities and the challenges. So our Innovations in Evidence series is really about exploring that. What are the things we can do to make evidence more available, more accessible, and try and ensure it is better used and applied in policymaking. So our event today is exploring specifically how data can inform policymaking. And really what we want to think about is how can we use data to better manage and deliver our public services and ensure better policy is made to deliver better outcomes for the people. And I think it's worth just reflecting on some of the context for this. We're all, I think, acutely aware of an extremely challenging fiscal and policy context, lots of financial constraint at all levels of government, a 20 billion economic black hole, and following years of austerity policies, an ever greater squeeze on public services. And this is all happening at the same time as government is facing immense and complex public policy challenges. So everything from the cost of living and rising inequalities to the climate crisis and what do we do about AI and how do we ensure continued health and well-being. So all of that, I think, means that we need all the help we can get, really, to make policy as robust as possible and to ensure that our public services can deliver, can innovate, can continue to serve our citizens. We can also see with the advent of the new government a renewed focus on what's been called modern digital government. Sounds great. I think we're still waiting for some of the definitions on what that might mean. We've seen proposals to create a national data library. We've seen proposals for a data bill to support the use of smart data in a public sector data exchange. And also quite a lot about how to strengthen digital infrastructure and data governance. So we're hoping that today is a really timely discussion. It's a moment for us to explore some key challenges, critical opportunities, and also think about the potential to capture and scale and continue to drive best practice. So I'd like to introduce our panel now. We are joined today by Dr. Emma Gordon, who is Director of the ADR UK Strategic Hub and of ADR in England. And I've just realised I've already used an acronym without explaining it. So Administrative Data Research UK, ADR UK henceforth, so you don't have to keep spelling it out, Emma. Emma's responsible for setting the strategic direction for the programme to improve access and analysis of administrative data to inform policy decisions. And she has a background working in government. She led the team in the Treasury supporting government economists and social researchers across government, and has also worked as Head of Health Analysis at the Office for National Statistics. Speaking of the Office for National Statistics, we're also very pleased to be joined by Mary Gregory, who is Director of Population Statistics at the ONS. Mary is responsible for capability and international work and data science projects related to health, international development and synthetic data. She was previously Deputy Director for Regulation at the Office for Statistics Regulation, and before that held a number of posts across government. We're also very pleased to be joined by Theo Blackwell, London's first and only Chief Digital Officer, a post he has held since 2017. And that involves leading on London-wide digital transformation, working with the boroughs across London, as well as looking at data and smart city initiatives. His role involves driving the take-up of innovation, technology and data-led approaches to service delivery and public engagement across London. So nice and easy there then. And Theo joined City Hall from Camden Council, where he was the Cabinet Member for Finance, Technology and Growth. And then finally, I'm very delighted to introduce my colleague, Dr. Bonnie Buyuklieva. Bonnie is a lecturer in Data Science for Society at the Department of Information Studies for UCL. She holds a PhD from the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis at UCL. And she's been working with IPPO on a project looking at local data use, which has been working with 5 local and regional authorities across the UK to understand how we can better build capacity at the subnational level and also ensure more join-up and coordination across the UK. So Bonnie is going to share the emerging findings from that work as part of our event today. So I think That's my introductions done. I forgot my housekeeping, which is that to say that we're really keen to get reflections and comments from you. So please do paste them in the chat and we will pick them up as we go through the discussion. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emma, who's going to kick us off with some reflections.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Great introduction. And I've got a few slides. I'll be whistling through them pretty quickly, but I'm very happy for these to be shared with the audience if they want to go through more detail. There's lots of links on the slides as well. So what is ADI UK? It's a UK-wide programme that's opening up access to government data so that we can get more research using these population-level linked data sets with the insights informing policy making across all 4 UK governments. We started in pilot phase in 2018, and then we went into our long-term delivery phase in 2021. And this is the kind of scale of what we've been able to do to date. So it's really sort of system-wide change of how researchers access linked administrative data. And these are our summary of our partners. The partners that we have in England, it's more dynamic than in the devolved administrations, just because the portfolio is so massive. We don't have core partners in the same way, apart from ONS, who are our partners. They support us by running the Secure Research Service, which is the ADR England Trusted Research Environment. But today I'm going to give you a summary of some of the examples of how we work with government to support this kind of analysis, and how we open up the data generally for wider research use. So when I talk about administrative data, I'm talking about everything from education records to court records, employment and earnings, as well as census responses, but also health data. And we're from the Economic Social Research Council, so we don't exclusively fund data linkage that only involve health data, but we're really, really interested in this intersection of linking health data with other forms of administrative data to really understand more about people's lives. So the old model for doing this was that a project will be proposed by an academic. You do all of the data governance and linkage and cleaning work to create the data set, which is really complex if you're linking across multiple data sets from multiple departments. You complete the project and then you delete the data set. And that system has proven incredibly inefficient, and it's a really, really costly way of opening up access to this data. And that's not just for us as funders, it's for data owners and researchers as well. This is a new model that we've come up with. So we do all of that really intense work to propose a data set and create it, and then we put it in a trusted research environment like the Secure Research Service, and then multiple projects can use it, and then the data set is retained for future use. And this is how we work with all of these government departments on the bottom, and many more. And I noticed that some people were really interested in about the kind of impact story and how we tell this. And when we started the ADI UK programme, we were really, really aware that the kind of standard academic model for doing this kind of research is to get access to the data and then publish it in a really kind of whizzy, high-level academic journal, and policymakers never see and never aware of the outcomes. Typically. So we built in right from the start this dual publication approach, where we really encourage our funded researchers. Obviously, other people that aren't funded by us can do what they like, but the people that are funded by us, we really encourage them to think really broadly about how to communicate the outputs. And we've had everything from comics to YouTube videos to blogs. And we really encourage jargon-free publications that go on our website, so there's one place to host all of this information. And obviously we encourage them to publish their peer-reviewed journals as well. So if I talk about some of the outcomes that we've funded, this is a fantastic piece of work by Dr. Alice Wickersham from King's College London, and she's accessing this data set that links national pupil database data with police national computer data. So if a child is convicted of a conviction or is cautioned for an offence, anytime during childhood and up to the age of 25, it will be recorded in this database. And she looked at, you know, of the people who end up with a criminal record, can you track back? And is there something about their learning history at school, going all the way back to primary school, that would allow you to identify the children at risk of this really poor outcome for them and society early? And lo and behold, you can. She came up with some mathematical modelling approach where you look at different learning trajectories from primary school to the end of secondary school. And it's these kids that start off with average learning and end up well below average. So you can track that all the way through school. And it's those children that it's nearly 9% of children who have that trajectory who are really, really at risk of ending up involved in the criminal justice system. If I go on to talk about a similar report, but this one published by government. So again, we're stimulating research being produced by government around this as well. Exactly the same data set. And they came to the conclusion that of those that are convicted of caution, and it is a small percentage of the population, thankfully, but of those, 80% who have been cautioned or sentenced for an offence have a special educational need. So government knows who these people are well before they end up involved in the criminal justice system. And 32% of the children who have been cautioned or sentenced for an offence are children in need, so are in some way involved in the care system. So again, if you know that, then government can start putting in policies to intervene earlier in these people's lives so we can avoid that really awful outcome for both the person, the individual, and society. Because as we know from recent headlines, it's very expensive to keep somebody in prison. Another example of where we work really, really closely with Ministry of Justice is to open up access to the cross-justice system linkage. Now, this is data that MOJ themselves didn't even have access to before we funded them to do all of the data cleaning and data linkage work. So it's absolutely, you know, benefit to them and benefit to us, benefit to the research community to do this work. So following this, we now know that following defendants' journey from the first known case in 2011, 18% of defendants returned 6 or more times. So if you think about the prison place sort of crisis at the moment, this gives you some sense of, you know, how to target interventions to reduce people having to go to prison in the first place. And the return rate of courts varied by defendant's first offence. We now know that the highest rate of return was for defendants convicted of theft. So 82% of those returners, and defendants most likely to return to the same offence group as their initial case. So they essentially specialise in the crime that they started out with. And there's also a link to deprivation, possibly not surprising, but you know, before we funded the Ministry of Justice to clean this data and make it available for research use and start this conversation with academics about how to interpret it and understand it, they didn't have these insights, which should hopefully be incredibly insightful into feeding into how you reduce the prison population now. So if we go into another example, so this is a really exciting data set that's linking decades worth of education outcomes data with decades worth of health outcomes data. And for those who have had children, you'll have been told that, you know, there's no difference if you're give birth at 37 weeks through to 42 weeks in terms of outcomes for your child. Well, it turns out there is, and please do read this paper if you want to know more, but there are statistically significant differences between a child born at 37 weeks and their education outcomes versus born at 40 or 41 weeks. And this data set, we've worked really hard with NHS England and DfE to open this up for wider research use, and it is now available for others to apply to use. I'm just going to whiz by the last example. There's a really, really useful example of where Scottish Government brought in minimum price per unit of alcohol policy, and England didn't bring that in. And we were able to track by assessing both the Scottish linked data as well as the English data to see what impact this policy had had, using England as the kind of proxy for, well, if this policy hadn't been introduced, what trajectory would we have expected? And lo and behold, the policy did work, and so the Scottish Government has agreed to maintain this policy going forward so they can further reduce alcohol-related deaths. And so that's everything. Very happy to answer any questions at the end, or please do get in touch with us if you want to know more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was really interesting and also quite inspiring, I think, to see some of those real world examples of where this is making a difference. I'm going to ask Theo to come in now and offer his reflections from working in London.
For those of you who were listening yesterday, these are sort of similar, but I've kind of developed them slightly. So I'm the Chief Digital Officer for London, as introduced. I've been there for 7 years, and so my role as regards data is really about how we improve our collective ability to use, manage, link up data in London for the maximum benefit of Londoners. And it's in context, and I kind of broadly speaking sort of say, oh, this is about preparing for the AI revolution, but it's not necessarily, it's also about how we use data. Data is absolutely fundamental in the digital age, and there are a number of elements in our broad city approach which I drive. One is connectivity infrastructure, and I'm here today at Connected Britain. And that's fundamental for data, not just because it gives you an internet connection in your home or business, but also the connected networks where use cases around sensors will develop significantly from that point. And I'll return to that a bit later. Secondly is how we collaborate at scale. The average size of a London borough, 250,000, 350,000 people, is a fair size, but in terms of data, we really need to think about how combinations of boroughs, if we get larger data sets, especially when we're looking at vulnerable populations, can be brought together, and data sharing is difficult. So therefore, we've got a program to join up data in the city, which is to go beyond our existing open data platform, the London Data Store, and join up data with the new Data for London library, which I'll turn to in a sec. And then trust and engagement. How do we engage with the public and data users around the proper use of data? So what do we use data for in our city? Of course, insights and analysis. We've from about 2015 onwards radically expanded the amount of mapping that we did. So easy to use geolocation data on where parks and rivers are, where trees are, core assets and such like. The city and local government as a whole loves performance management, so of course we use data for that. Transparency and the ability to show performance and basic statistics to the public. But we also use data for digital services. Data is behind digital services, and data can be used for more advanced data services than mapping. So, this would include things like the Planning Data Hub, which combines automation of the planning process to create a live feed of planning applications across 35 authorities. Data services that allow us to understand the economy better. So here we've got in this long list an example of a data service where we bring together Microsoft spend and telecommunications data so we can understand the busyness of our high streets. So radically advancing our ability to understand local economy, which previously just relied on kind of like quarterly government data sets mashed up with maybe some work from consultants, reports that we'd probably do once every 5 years that would influence policy. We've changed from that situation to something where we really have a monthly oversight of the health of our high streets. And data services such as the Rough Sleeping Index is increasingly bringing in data from various other agencies such as charities, government bodies, and councils, which obviously has data sharing challenges in terms of quality and information governance, and bring it together so we can get one view of homelessness in the capital. Increasingly, we're also looking towards artificial intelligence in a range of like narrow use cases and partnerships with private sector bodies. All of this is enabled because we've got a pretty decent foundation in data, especially with Transport for London. So, for example, our ability to use predictive data analytics to understand congestion, emissions, and safety impacts was the subject of an open call from Transport for London. Transport for London's 10 years of doing open feeds that power wayfinding enabled it to do a more evolved partnership with Google Maps, for example, in January, which changed the way that Google Maps works, which is very pro-motorist, and now enables you as a cyclist to take the least busy the least busy roads used by cars home, or directs you towards one of the mayor's cycle paths so that you can travel home safely. So the ability of data, in a sense, to go beyond insight and support policy, which is promoting cycling and walking and so on, really fundamentally important, only comes around with a certain amount of data maturity. So our new city data service, Data for London, is based upon the Mayor's manifesto commitments in 2021 and reiterated in 2024. And it involves rebuilding the data store, which is fundamentally an open data platform, to enable further collaboration across administrative boundaries using data. In order to do this, we have to enhance the discoverability of the data sets in our city, improve data sharing, which also means creating pan-London information governance frameworks, and also create the teams that can enable collaboration with that data. So the platform sort of looks like this. It inverts the concept of a kind of smart city data platform. So put out of your minds the kind of Hunger Games style data platform where every piece of data is gathered in one big kind of data lake, data locker. Instead, it's much more like a library. It's an index of what and where important, critically enabling data sets are in our city, of open data and the metadata, the descriptions of private data sets. And then doing this and combining it with a program which involves a data users community, data challenges, information governance work, data ethics work, we aim to one by one remove the barriers and points of friction that have stopped data to be used at scale and therefore hampering innovation and scale in our city. Fundamentally, this is about fixing the plumbing, improving discovery, improving sharing, providing assurance over access, and also working with data users on how we can really get value from that data. I was just toying with this as I was introduced, but I'll give you one case study here of like where this could go. We're currently, because of our work on improving collaboration in London, we're currently deploying 200 damp and mold sensors in social housing across 18 boroughs. The time taken us to spin up this scheme was about 10 weeks, which is a radical transformation in our ability to do something at scale. We're now testing how we can distribute and deploy those sensors in boroughs, and providing support and resources to those housing teams to ensure that they're successfully placed and the data flows. This will actually give us a pan-London view over something that has become a pressing housing delivery and human concern facing local authorities. That is, families, children living in homes with damp and mold. And phase 2 will obviously take this further, but also enable collaborations with academia, with the data flowing out of NHS, so we can really begin to get real insights into something that we had very, very poor data on in the first place. So I'll finish by saying that this is all happening in the context where there's an exciting discussion, as noted at the beginning, with Whitehall, very much a reset. We can talk to Whitehall now, which is great. There are use cases that are really driving the use of data in our city, especially around net zero, climate resilience, and adoption. There's real opportunity with public health to combine the urban data, which is the strength of a city like London or cities like Manchester and so on. We also see that there is a growing potential with the civic application of computer vision, which we anticipate will rise over the next few years, perhaps slightly in its infancy, but a rich data source, that can not just be used for community safety purposes, but actually can be used for environmental purposes. And then where does this take us? What we're setting up is essentially a library index of data sets. What could happen in a number of years is something akin to open banking, where data users, whether they are civic, academic, commercial, citizen, can actually have access to data, much like open banking has enabled access, the open banking framework has enabled access to financial data, stimulating innovation, providing that security, and providing a new route to innovation around the built environment and place to improve the lives of our residents. So I'll end there. I hope that's useful counter through. And sorry for the background noise. Someone was hammering at something while I was speaking.
Just added a little bit of ambience, Theo. That was utterly fascinating. Thank you. And really quite interesting to see that well, it looks from the outside, very strategic use of data sets to address really key policy challenges from London. So, reducing crime and homelessness and air pollution, it's really interesting to see how they're being leveraged. Lots to come back to. Please do, everybody online, continue to add your questions and thoughts in the Q&A. We will pick up as many as we can. But before that, we're going to turn to Mary to hear her thoughts.
Hello, thank you. Great to join you. I just thought I'd briefly say a bit about me and who I am, and then I'm going to take a slightly different approach to how I give a few examples, but hopefully it will prompt some questions. So I'm currently Director of Population Statistics in ONS, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But I think it's quite an interesting link with what I've done before in terms of data science campus in ONS, regulator, but also worked in different government departments where I've worked closely with policy, trying to make sure that we're really in the centre of that policy making. So I'm going to talk about kind of 3 lessons, I think, that come from how to make data have a good impact on policy, but use some examples as I go through. I think the first one is in terms of the use of data and the data available. And Emma and Theo have given some brilliant examples, which are going to overlap a bit with some of what I'm going to talk about. But I think where we are now, as everyone already knows, is such a different place to even 10 years ago in terms of the data availability and what we can do. That's got massive benefits, but also some challenges. And what I'm working on a lot at the moment is thinking about how do we measure the population using administrative data. So people will be very familiar, I'm sure, with the census, and that's been our main way to measure it. And then in between censuses, we try and do estimates. We're trying to be more sophisticated in how we can produce those using administrative data. That is got incredible potential, and we've already seen some of that in what we've published, and some people will have seen that, I'm sure. But that idea of linking different admin sources to get new insights, in a little bit like the way that Emma's already described, we can find out things that we couldn't before. But in doing that, we need to think about challenges that we perhaps haven't experienced before. So whilst there might be lots of expertise in survey methods or census under coverage, there's not as much expertise in where are the gaps in the admin data. So to try and kind of counter some of that, we use lots of different sources of admin data. So typically the health data is a really valuable source because it gives core information on where people live. Every year, a lot of people will update their records if they move, but we know there are groups that aren't so good at updating their records. Often students, for example, might not re-register at home, or they might not leave the doctor they've had at the university when they leave. So we have to look at what are the other sources that could help with that, and we can look at something like data from Higher Education Statistics Agency. There's also other groups of the population that we find really hard to measure. So we look at all the admin data available, we do our best to match it as well as possible, and we get some really good estimates. But I think the thing that even then takes that a step further, which we're also working on at the moment, is how can we then make use of all this wealth of other data that exists? And I think this is the key message I'd like to get across in this bit, is that kind of triangulation of different data sources. I think a lot of analysts, and I don't know how many people on the call are analysts, are used to a world where you have a data source, you have a survey, and you say, great, we've got some survey results. Whereas now I think we're saying, right, we've got 5 or 6 different sources, or maybe 100 sources that can tell you something. We don't think any one might be necessarily perfect, but between them we can get a really good picture of what's going on. And it's how we make that jump to go from this kind of mass of data that exists to that really coherent story that accurately can influence policy in the right way. And then for us, to take an example, the movement of population is a real challenge because people don't necessarily register address changes on admin data as fast as government might like or people might expect. So what else can we look at? And a couple of examples that we're thinking about in ONS are, how can we use mobile phone data to see where people are moving? Again, that's got many limitations because you don't know if people have moved house. You can make judgments on what's going on, but it tells you where people are moving around. Another example, which we've been looking at, is how you use financial transactions data, because again, you might know the home postcode, you might see where people are spending money. If you want to understand kind of where people are moving in the daytime, you can start to get a sense, or if you see patterns over time, you can start to understand, have they perhaps moved house? So by combining all of this, we're hoping that we get much better measures of internal migration, but also you could start to look at more granular things like, how does population change for a particular season or a particular time of day? Which might mean that you've got better information for informing policy on transport networks or businesses or services that you need. Do you need more people in that city on a Friday night because you know actually there are lots of people there, or is it actually relatively quiet? The other thing that I wanted to pull out though is quite often it's easy to think about all the massive data that you've got, but what about the data that you haven't got? And an example that always strikes me as making this really memorable is, many of you might have heard it, but the planes in World War II. So when they were trying to work out where to strengthen the planes, they looked at the planes that came back and looked at where they'd been hit. But of course, they only looked at the planes that came back, which is probably the ones where the hits hadn't done as much damage. And they didn't look at the planes that never came back to know which bits of the plane really need reinforcing. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about any kind of policy implications. It's easy to think, well, we've got data on this, this, and this, but how do we make sure we've understood the groups we don't have data on? And again, I think some of what Emma described is probably where historically we've not had data, so we haven't thought about it. And now the work Emma's organisation funding is really helping with those insights. And for us, that's quite often in ONS, thinking about how do we make sure we've got the kind of smaller underrepresented groups in the population. And because actually small differences in the numbers there can be quite a big impact on those small populations. And then my third point, I guess, is around understanding the data well enough to know about the appropriate use. So we've got lots of data. I'm sure lots of us are working in a world where we've got access to more and more data. But how do we make sure that it's appropriate for the purposes we want? Because some data might have masses of limitations, but be brilliant for informing a particular policy, whilst there'll be other data which looks really good on the face of it, but isn't right for that policy. And I think an example for what we do within my team is something like population projections. So that is a really hard thing to project the future population. We in the team have a really good understanding of its limitations, and a lot of our kind of expert users will understand that, but we need to work really hard to make sure the people using it understand this is not a prediction of the future. This is a projection based on certain assumptions around migration or fertility or life expectancy. And once people understand that, they can make much better decisions on the basis of what we're providing. And they can perhaps think about different scenarios, and do they expect one of our variants with higher or lower migration to be more realistic for their policy planning. So that's quite a run through, and hopefully we'll provoke some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mary. That felt like a really good little insider insight into some of the ongoing work at ONS, and how you're sort of having to respond in real time to some of these changes. Really interested to pick that up too. But before that, we'll hear from Bonnie, who is, as I said, going to offer some reflections coming out of an ongoing IPPO project looking at local data use in the UK. Over to you, Bonnie.
I'm going to do a quick introduction and maybe reflect back on some of the things that Mary just said. So as Sarah introduced me, I'm a lecturer in Data Science for Society at the Department of Information Studies. And today we've been talking a lot about data, but I think it might be useful to have a think about how data is actually part of a bigger system where data, information, knowledge, and what you do with that knowledge is a slightly longer pipeline. So how you go from data to policymaking is actually a process. So I'm here to introduce our ongoing project, kindly funded by the UKRI's ESRC and UCL Public Policy, on building local data capabilities, which is a collaboration between University College London, where I'm based, and 5 combined and local authorities. Now, this work is carried out in response to the pre-election subnational data strategy, which sets out the ambition to think subnationally by default. When we talk about building capacity in this context, we mean developing the skills, resources, and systems necessary to use data operationally that enable quicker and more informed actions in policy making that could directly benefit the people and places that they are meant to serve. So bridging that gap between data and the benefits thereof. Our project aims to build local data capacity by collaborating directly with partner authorities and enabling the generation of scalable insights and recommendations that we hope can be applied a bit more broadly. So I mentioned that our project is a collaboration. Here are the 5 partner authorities. These include the Greater London Authority, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, the West Midlands Combined Authority, Belfast City Council, and Rhondda-Cynon-Taf County Borough Council. Now, it's a broad group, and each partner case study involves the placement of one of our UCL Data for Local Policy Fellows from my home department, the Department of Information Studies. And each fellow is embedded locally to help with some individually proposed by the partner Data for Policy project. After some time working on the project, we then followed up this work by a set of semi-structured interviews on using data for policy in that specific context. Again, to get that idea of how do we go from data to policy making on the ground. So our fellows worked on a wide range of projects as the partners proposed different focus. So for example, the GLA put forward developing the London building stock model as a priority. Greater Manchester proposed reflecting on their existing local area energy plans to inform their next iteration. In Rhondda-Cynon-Taf, the priority was to contribute to the multi-year health determinant research collaboration with a focus on how this might benefit children and early years services. Whereas in the West Midlands and Belfast, the focus was more on skills and employment, where key topics were approached in slightly different ways, from monitoring progress to planning for it. Now you can read a bit more about the individual projects because, as you know, these are, as you can imagine, I guess, these have a lot of intricacies and detail to them. But if you follow the QR code on IPPO's website, you would have a brief overview of the fellows' experience and an introduction to their projects from the middle of the project. So I guess what is important to bring this all together is to think about the fellows' contribution. So these are, like the projects, quite wide-ranging. But we can organize these across several challenges. So these range from insufficient in-house capacity to parse incoming data from consultants, to unblocking internal data sharing. As Theo mentioned, data sharing is non-trivial. These include also highlighting good practice and institutional memory that really can't be taken for granted. And then being able to articulate more challenging issues of data maturity. So again, understanding that longer pipeline of how data turns into information and then knowledge and ultimately strategic decisions in policy. So each project and related set of interviews contributed to a better picture of what policymaking needs on the ground. As I mentioned, this is a work in progress, but I can share some early takeaways from bringing the 5 case studies together. And these broadly fit into 4 themes. Effective data sharing and standardization came up very often as something that is important across different levels and needed to prevent siloed practices, whilst data governance and policy development is needed to enable trust and continuity, which is really essential for these type of ethical and productive data uses, especially when we start thinking about enriching data the way Mary mentioned with estimates, experimentation. However, to fully harness the value of data, continuous training and data literacy efforts are vital, because these equip stakeholders across the data policy pipeline with the skills to shepherd data across different desks before it actually becomes operationally useful as policy. And finally, to keep the machine running, I think holistic development and community engagement emerged as an important task to integrate wider community or multi-agency insights to really fill those data gaps and calibrate goals with on-the-ground insights. So overall, building local data capabilities for smart policymaking, the theme of the session, needs continuous iteration. It needs a focus on a shared vocabulary and active local data culture. So I've included this slide to remind you that this is work in progress and hopefully encourage you to keep an eye out for our full report, where we unpack the themes in more detail and relate these to recommendations across different levels of government. We expect this to be out in the next few weeks. And before I close, I'd like us to think about the theme of today's session, which is how data can be used best for smart policymaking. We can take a step back to think about what this means and how it applies to our project. So the word smart, the etymological origin, comes from the idea of being sharp, quick, and very neat in action. It has this idea of precision. Policy, on the other hand, has its roots in Greek to refer to city and citizenship, or planning for people. So how can we plan for people in a concise and sharp way? Now, when thinking about building local data capabilities and data for policymaking in this context, I think I'd like to leave us with one thought, is that we should think that data means very little without an inclusive but practical sense of information literacy and data culture to shepherd it across that development from data to being something that's actually useful in policy. Thank you very much for your time. Do keep an eye out in the next coming weeks through the IPPO website and the UCL Department of Information Studies website for our full report. And if you have any more specific questions, feel free to pop these into the chat or get in touch with myself or my colleague, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Bunny. What an utterly fascinating set of presentations. It's provided huge amounts of food for thought, and I imagine stimulated more questions than we have time for. But we do have about 10 minutes, and I think there were some interesting themes that have been coming up from what you've all been talking about and from some of the questions we've been seeing coming through the chat. So I think it might be worth picking some of those up and asking you all to just briefly reflect on I'd like to start, I think, with the issues around the persistent challenges in terms of joining up and sharing data. I think everybody can see there's immense value. Everybody can see the benefits, and you've just given us all some great examples of it. But actually, there are lots of complexities. Somebody talked about NHS data sets in the chat. Somebody else talked about comparability across regions. So I wonder if we could just reflect from your perspective very briefly on what you think perhaps some of the key challenges are in terms of that data sharing and joining up, and any bright ideas you have for how to address them. Emma, can we start with you?
That's a whole other presentation about key challenges and what we've learned along the way. I think my biggest lesson is not to underestimate from our perspective, you know, the sort of funders' perspective and the researchers' perspective, how much work, when we ask government to open up access to a data set, how much work that actually entails, because this is really messy data. None of this data was collected, you know, off a system designed for that data to be opened up for research use. It's all been designed for operational uses. You know, quite often it's systems that, you know, the data is being overwritten whenever there's a change in the data, for example, which is not how you design a research use of data system. And there's all sorts of messy complexities that, you know, really need to be understood. And that's one thing that's been really good about the ADI UK programme compared to other ways that we've been able, we've tried to fix this problem, is this recognition and acknowledgement that sometimes it genuinely needs investment into a government department to be able to open up access to that data. And so, you know, for that to happen and for that department to want to engage you, there has to be benefit back. So we put an awful lot of work into, you know, playing back the outcomes of the research, getting government departments involved in the commissioning of that research, what makes a good project, you know, what's going to be interesting to them. And, you know, with a promise that, you know, it will be available for wider research use over and above the things that we're commissioning directly. But there has to be that benefit. You know, it can't just be a one-way track where the data is opened up and the data owners don't get any benefit back to them, because we have to acknowledge the work that they're putting into this as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Mary, could we ask you for some brief thoughts?
Definitely, and I think I'd agree with a lot of what Emma said, and I think that point she made at the end about if there's no benefit to the data provider, they're not going to want to invest. And I think largely what we've found is that although there are legal things and you have to be really careful with security and ethics, that's not normally the thing that's actually the barrier. There are any number of barriers, and there's always another one when you think you've overcome the one before. So I think it's kind of the persistence, but most of all, how do you persuade them that there is value in them doing it and that they want to do it? Because then suddenly the legal barriers they think they found are not there anymore.
Great, thank you. Theo?
At the beginning of our journey rebuilding the London data store to be the Data for London library, we talked to quite a lot of cities, both here and internationally, and also some US states, some country governments, about data sharing, and everybody seemed to have the same set of challenges. So we set about identifying them as points of friction, see what we could do to actually reduce them. So the first step really for us was to establish a community, and the London Office of Technology and Innovation, which brings together the CDOs and other teams, innovation teams from the 32 boroughs in one place in a kind of funded community, was the first step. I don't think you could have a new data platform without establishing that community first. And I think the challenge with open data is that community had kind of been implied rather than supported, and we didn't really get the most of the open data revolution because we didn't invest enough in the kind of curation of the kind of questions we wanted that data to help us solve. So first step was address the community problem. The second thing that we see, or a range of things that we see that hamper data, are technology barriers. So a huge amount of service data from citizens is locked up in effectively straitjackets imposed by monopolistic IT vendors that essentially control verticals, social care, housing, etc., etc. And that's an unsatisfactory situation, but it's a reality. It's something that we would ask government to do something about. IG is also an issue. If you look at places like Manchester Combined Authority, they've invested a lot in creating an IG function and also using technology to streamline the IG process. Something as simple as a library of data sharing templates. I mean, that's actually been in existence for quite a long time in the Manchester area. They've got highly skilled people and team that bring together data and negotiate it through its sensitivity. We copied that and developed that in London. You need leadership, and then finally, the list goes on. But I will stop my comments there. There's a certain amount of capacity that you need to build into the system, but identifying the range of problems first step.
Brilliant, thank you. And Bonnie, do you want to add to that briefly? Perhaps the capacity point is something we've seen in the IPPO project you've been leading on.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to jump back and highlight Theo's point on it's actually a problem of data sharing is a problem of community first. Then I'd argue continuity and curation. And I think for all three of these things, you need people. And I think that's the role of capacity. And when he was talking about IG or information governance, I think it's about identifying the roles and acknowledging this as a task. So data sharing is not just kind of a nice afterthought on the way of, exploiting data. It's actually a really fundamental milestone. And it takes people who look at things and are trained to look at things and a type of institutional memory to remember what information we have, what it's been used for, and what we might want to update it or reuse it for. So again, I think at the core, although we're talking about data, we need to think about the people behind that data and the people enabling those pipelines. And that, I think, is a question of continuity and technical literacy. And I don't mean technical literacy that everyone needs to be a data scientist, but this appreciation that actually I don't need to be a data person to understand the value of data or safeguard that. So I think capacity is an important investment in people.
Excellent. Thank you, Bonnie. We're going to sort of stay with some of that theme, but I think I'd like us to draw on some of the questions in the chat to think about not just data sharing, but how you make data as visible and accessible as possible. How it can be open to citizens, how it can be open to the broader public. There's a disability campaigner in the chat wondering how she can access data. So there's data sharing in terms of between the organisations that have technical expertise, but what about the broader accessibility question? There's a lot of powerful potential there, but it's not straightforward, is it? Can we start with Theo? Again,
yeah, so data needs to be fundamentally connected with the community in all its forms. Otherwise, it doesn't address their challenges. We need to understand the public health impacts across a diverse city like London's. The questions got to come from the community, which can only come from engagement. So, as I'll go back to my point of we start with building really firm professional community foundations. Part of our journey is to get to the point where we're actually launching data challenges to address specific problems that have arisen straight from the community. We're not quite there yet. Yeah. But if we don't have that engagement, then it will tend towards the elite, which is kind of what people might criticize it for anyway.
Thank you. I'm very mindful of time. Mary or Emma or Bonnie, is there anything that you wanted to add on that point as quickly as you can?
Yeah, just a final point. We've got a sort of phrase in ADA UK about the missed use of data, that so everybody is so concerned about keeping the data secure and everything. But, you know, if we've got the systems and services right, you know, to allow secure access to data, then it's about, you know, getting that data used by the people that, you know, are qualified to use it, but getting those outputs out there so that we can be building that trust with the public that this is all being done in the public good.
Excellent, thank you. Last thoughts, Mary, Bonnie?
I can jump in just to say that I think the idea of challenges is really important. And I think that a top-down approach of we're going to get it right the first time is unrealistic. So the idea of iterating on things and iterating quickly and stress testing it with the community so that you can see different use cases, different demands, different needs is pretty essential. And it's a task in and of its own that you can't really cut corners on.
Thank you, really important.
Thank you. I think I just add that public good point, and I guess that drives everything we do in an organisation that's here to provide statistics for public good. But I think it's important for a lot of us.
Excellent. I'm really sad that we are out of time. We're at 12 o'clock. There's so much more we could have talked about. We didn't talk about quality of data. We didn't talk about scaling data and balancing that with hyperlocal use. We didn't get onto AI and the opportunities and threats thereof, so perhaps we need another event. But for now, I just want to extend a huge thank you to Mary and Emma and Bonnie and Theo for sharing their expertise and their insights, and for a really, really stimulating discussion. Thank you to everybody who joined the event and for your questions and reflections in the chat. It's really great to see such an engaged discussion. And I think it only remains for me to all wish you a cold but happy day for the rest of your day. Thank you once again, and goodbye, everybody.